Hi, I'm Deboki, and I am super excited because today I am going to be reviewing the Vanity Fair Diaries by Tina Brown. I got really lucky recently and basically read 3 books in a row that as I was reading them, I knew, I had a feeling that these were going to become some of my favorite books, and that panned out. And so I'm excited to be getting to review all of those over the next few weeks. My reviews have slowed down a bit over the past month or so because of just wrapping things up and moving and all of that chaos, but I sort of started taking to Twitter to document a lot of my reading. So if you follow me there, you can probably guess what 2 of those books that I have been in love with are. The book I'm going to be reviewing today, the Vanity Fair Diaries, is not one that I obsessively live tweeted with all of my thoughts about, but I still really love it and I'm excited to basically get into why. So the Vanity Fair Diaries is a memoir by Tina Brown. Tina Brown is a journalist. She's probably most well known for editing Tatler UK, The New Yorker, and of course Vanity Fair. As you might guess from the title, this book covers the diaries that Tina Brown wrote during her time at Vanity Fair, which pretty much spans the 80s, and it documents her choices as a journalist, as an editor, as a wife, and eventually as a mother, as she's learning to navigate this new city and this new job, which comes with all sorts of new rules and politics. Brown engaged pretty significantly with New York society, and these diaries are strewn with 80s pop culture cameos that are both entertaining and integral to Brown's vision for the magazine that she's taken over. These diaries also cover a lot of Brown's personal feelings about marriage and motherhood and how they fit in with her own professional aspirations. I don't really know that much about the magazine world, and I didn't really know who Tina Brown was until she started doing the publicity for this book. She did a few interviews on different podcasts for it, which I'll try to find and link to below. And I think what really stood out to me that made me really want to learn more about her was that she seemed both really engaged with pop culture but also really pragmatic about its role. I think just in shaping a lot of our experiences overall. Listening to those interviews got me really interested in the book, and while I was waiting for it, I actually read a book that she wrote a while ago called The Diana Chronicles, which is a biography about Princess Diana. And I really loved her approach in that book to combining that pop culture commentary, which kind of a general sort of historical context, in that case with the royal family, and it made me even more excited to read this book. At the same time, for all my obsessiveness with pop culture, I am not really a vintage pop culture enthusiast, and I'm definitely not an 80s pop culture enthusiast, so I wasn't really sure I was gonna click with a lot of these 80s references. I just didn't think they were gonna mean much to me. But as I've said, I love this book, and I think first and foremost, this book falls in the genre of competence porn, where basically you're watching someone who is very, very good at their job talk about what they're doing for their job, just explaining what they do, explaining why it works, and going through just the basic mechanics of what they do. And that's something I love. I love hearing people talk about their work. I love hearing people talk about all the factors and decisions that shape things that we take for granted, what a magazine cover looks like. Brown gets into the nitty-gritty details of how you find a good roster of writers, how you develop those writers, how you come up with a good magazine layout, how you time the release of certain articles, and all of these elements of magazine making that seem overwhelming but that she seems supremely confident with. And when I say confident, she's so confident to the point where she's also able to acknowledge her weaknesses or her mistakes. And I love reading those kinds of people who have that level of self-awareness, that they're able to then go back and not just say that they're the best, they can also go back and iterate and become better. There's also a lot of navigating of internal work politics. The magazine world apparently is, I assume a lot of jobs like this is full of politics. And Vanity Fair is part of the Condé Nast family of magazines, so it's not just Vanity Fair. There's a lot of stuff wrapped up with Vogue and stuff in there, so that was really exciting to learn about. It's gossipy, and it's also instructive, sort of in a how do you navigate this kind of workplace situation. Like I said, this Vanity Fair is part of the Condé Nast family of magazines, and probably the best known Condé Nast magazine, in my estimate is maybe Vogue. So if you've watched the September issue, which is a documentary about one of the issues of Vogue being put together, and you liked that documentary, I highly, highly recommend this book for you, because I think you'll find a lot of the same sort of like internal workplace issues, you know, basic mechanics of a magazine, like all of those facets are in this book, but just in a different setting. And if this book sounds intriguing to you, also highly recommend that documentary. I love it. Anna Wintour even makes a few appearances in this book, which I think is a treat. I think it's the closest most of us will ever come to feeling like she's a real person and not like a pop culture parody of herself almost at this point. Going back to some of my initial concerns about the references to 80s pop culture, I ended up really loving it, and I think it's just because of this ability that Tina Brown has to really tie pop culture to the history and society like surrounding it. And so in the case of this book, a lot of the excesses that she's describing that are really attributed to 80s pop culture, they're really like reflected as well in the Reagan presidency, which she talks about, and that is also shown in Vanity Fair. Those excesses then trickle down to, you know, characters like, at the time, a then innocuous though still bombastic Donald Trump. But that culture of the 80s is also tied to the tragedy and the masking of the AIDS epidemic, which Brown witnesses firsthand as many of her friends in the industry fall victim to the disease. And I think she synthesizes all these aspects, these complicated aspects of 80s pop culture really nicely in this book, both in her professional and personal life. These diaries are also a very personal perspective of marriage and motherhood. Brown's husband is a renowned journalist who's much older than her, and much of the book is kind of set against the backdrop of them finding ways to basically, you know, as the cliche kind of goes, balance their marriage and their careers, especially in terms of distance as they get opportunities in different locations. To me personally, that was something that just resonated, as my husband and I have been in a long distance relationship for a very long time, and it was just really interesting to me to kind of see how she and her husband managed it in the context of, you know, their own story. When Brown has her first child, you can also see how her perspective on her career shifts, though clearly not to its detriment, as she's had, you know, an enormous amount of success both at Vanity Fair and beyond. The whole can she have it all narrative, you know, that kind of thing is a little bit cliche. It's frustrating for a lot of us to hear, but I think it works really well in this diary, because I don't think the question really is can you have it all. It's more just a personal dialogue of, you know, what she can and can't have and what it means to her to want, I guess, anything in terms of motherhood and her career. I really appreciated that willingness to engage in that perspective for her, like that willingness to share her story. I think it might be the kind of thing that's too personal to be really edifying, but it's also engaging because it's so relatable to what a lot of us consider at, you know, some point in our lives. I think I would have enjoyed this book maybe at any point in my life, but it's especially clicking with me right now, which is probably part of why I love it so much. I am obviously not Tina Brown. I am not a 30-year-old wonderkind magazine editor. I am a 28-year-old intern. But along with her pop culture obsessiveness, there's just a lot in this book that resonated with questions I have about my own career and personal life, just because of the crossroads that I'm at that feels very similar to where she was at and at that point, and that she started documenting her time at Vanity Fair. In some ways, I think these diaries are a really interesting exercise. It made me think a lot about like when you go back and you read your own diaries from like middle school and high school, and you're like, I don't know, I kind of like, I'm like, I'll read them and just be like, oh my god, wow, like A, I forgot about that, and B, that thing I thought this thing about, I now think something completely different. These diaries obviously have a lot of insight that she was realizing at the time that she was writing them, but there's also clearly insight that she's built into the way that she's published them, that are a product of editing them for a general audience several decades after she had initially written them. And that can be both related to the way that she shapes her personal narrative, but also the way the choices she makes in the pop culture figures that she talks about, especially Donald Trump, who, when she documented him in the book, was just this asshole and is now an important asshole. These diaries almost gave me an inferiority complex about my own diary habits, but it also kind of made me want to step my game up a little and like be a little bit more thorough about, you know, what I document. No one's gonna want to read my diaries in a few decades, but I might want to go back to them and see what insight I got at that time and what insight I can get from them in the future. I think this book is so good, and I highly recommend it to anyone who is looking for a good memoir to read, or who wants to read about like a really successful woman who just learn about, I don't know, what that kind of career is like. I love this book. You're probably gonna hear me talk about it again at the end of the year when I list out all the books I loved. Yeah, thank you guys for watching. Bye.